I'll tell you something about the day I finally walked into that room. Not the first time I walked into that house. That was 23 years earlier, through the back gate, wearing a second-hand jacket, carrying a toolbox I had borrowed from my neighbor because I didn't own one yet. No. I'm talking about the day I walked in through the front door with a briefcase, in a suit that cost more than my mother earned in 4 months, and sat down at the head of their conference table. They didn't recognize me. That's the part that still hits me sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet. They looked right at me, the same eyes I'd spent years trying to forget, and they saw nothing. A stranger, a professional, someone with authority. They had no idea that the man holding their entire financial future in his hands had once cleaned the gutters of their house for $12 an hour. I want you to understand something before I go any further. This is not a story about revenge. I've told myself that for years, and most of the time I almost believe it. This is a story about what happens when someone takes something from you that they had no right to take, and what it costs you over a lifetime to take it back. Not the victory, the cost. Because by the time I sat in that room and watched Tyler Harrington's face finally go pale, I had already paid a price I'm still not sure was worth it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually started. Not the mansion, before that. I grew up in a part of town that doesn't get mentioned much unless something goes wrong there. A neighborhood where the houses were small and the yards were patchy, and you could tell which families were doing slightly better than the others by how new their window screens were. We were not doing slightly better. My mother worked as a building cleaner at a downtown office complex. She left the house before I woke up and came home after dark most days, and when she did come home, her hands were raw from the cleaning chemicals, and she moved slowly, like someone carrying extra weight that wasn't visible. My father had been gone since I was 7. There was no dramatic exit, no final argument I could point to. He was just there one day, and then he wasn't, and my mother never talked about it. And eventually I stopped waiting for the conversation that would explain everything. I was 12 when I understood, clearly and without any softening, that no one was coming to fix our situation. Not a relative, not a program, not some shift in luck. My mother was holding everything together with the same numb discipline she applied to her work, and she was doing it alone. And if I was going to be anything other than a version of the neighborhood I grew up in, it was going to come from me and nowhere else. I don't say that to sound impressive. I say it because it shaped every decision I made afterward, including the ones I'll regret for the rest of my life. By the time I was in high school, I had already been working for 2 years, grocery bagging, lawn mowing, helping a neighbor haul furniture when he ran a small moving operation on weekends. Nothing steady, nothing that paid well, but enough to help my mother cover the months when the heating bill was more than expected, or when her hours at the office got cut. I was quiet at school, not shy exactly. I knew how to talk. I knew how to read a room. But I had learned early that standing out in certain directions cost more than it was worth. I kept my grades up because I knew grades were a door, and I kept my head down because I knew high school was not the place where anything real was decided. That was probably the first version of the mistake I would keep making for years. The belief that if I was good enough, careful enough, invisible enough, the world would be fair to me in return. I was 16 when I got the job at the Harrington house. I found it through a posting on a community board at the church my mother attended. A handwritten card that said, "Property Maintenance Assistant, flexible hours, must be reliable." The address was on the north end of the city, in the section where the streets got wider, and the trees got bigger and the houses started sitting farther back from the road. I had biked through that area a few times, not as a destination, but as a detour. The way you sometimes take a longer route home just to see something different. The houses there looked like a different category of existence. Not just bigger, different in the way that suggested everything inside them was operating by rules I hadn't been taught. I called the number on the card and was told to come on a Saturday. I borrowed my neighbor's toolbox. He had a proper one, red metal, organized, and rode my bike the 4 miles to the address, arriving 15 minutes early and waiting outside the back gate until exactly the time I was told. The man who let me in was the estate manager, a quiet, methodical man in his 50s who went by the name Mr. Carter. He showed me around the property in about 20 minutes. The tool shed, the maintenance schedule, the list of weekly tasks, gutters, walkways, garden edging, exterior window cleaning, minor repairs. He was professional and efficient, and spoke to me like a person who was capable of doing the work, which at the time I found quietly remarkable. He said I would be paid weekly in cash, and that if the work was consistent I could expect more hours in the summer. I said thank you. I meant it more than he knew. The house was extraordinary. I had never been that close to a property like that. 3 stories, stone facade, a circular driveway with a fountain that actually ran, the kind of house that communicated, simply by existing, that the people who lived in it had never worried about a heating bill. I was careful not to stare. For the first 6 weeks, the family was almost entirely invisible to me. I worked Saturday mornings and one afternoon during the week. I saw the housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Brooks, who was polite and efficient, and made it clear without saying anything directly that my job was to stay in my lane. I saw Mr. Carter occasionally. I saw the black SUVs that came and went from the main garage. I did not see the family. Then one Saturday in October I was edging the back garden when the rear door opened and 2 teenagers came out. The boy was tall, with the easy physical confidence of someone who had played sports since childhood, without ever having to try very hard. He had dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been designed for yearbook photos, and the particular brand of relaxed authority that comes not from any achievement, but simply from having grown up being told, constantly and by everyone around you, that you were the kind of person who mattered. That was Tyler Harrington. He was 17. The girl was a year younger and moved through space the way certain people do when they've always had an audience, deliberately, aware of her own effect. Her name was Madison. She had her mother's cheekbones and her father's eyes, and the specific bored confidence of someone who has never had to wonder whether they belong in a room. They walked past me, and Tyler glanced over with an expression that said I had been registered and categorized in under a second. Not contempt, worse, the absence of any reaction at all, the way you look at a piece of outdoor furniture. Madison didn't look at all. They went inside and I kept edging and nothing happened, but something had shifted. I had been seen, and what I had seen in return had lodged in me like a piece of glass too small to remove. 3 weeks later, I found out they went to my school. Jefferson High was large enough that the social geography was relatively fixed, and the Harrington children existed in a tier of that geography I had no contact with. The same school, technically. Different hallways, different lunch tables, different entire sets of social rules. I had seen Tyler in the hallway before, had probably seen Madison too, without registering them as the same people I'd seen at the house. Once I made the connection, I felt a brief, specific unease, the kind you get when 2 parts of your life that should stay separate are suddenly touching. I should have quit right then. I know that now. I've known it for years. If I had quit the job at the Harrington house in October of that year, the next 23 years of my life would have been different. Maybe better. Maybe I'd have found some other wound to shape myself around. I don't know. But I needed the money. My mother's hours had been cut again, and the Harrington job paid more than anything else I could find, and so I stayed. For about 2 months after making the connection, nothing changed. Tyler and Madison ignored me at school with the same comfortable thoroughness they'd displayed in their backyard. I ignored them back. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. Then someone told someone, I don't know who. It might have been Tyler himself, casually, without thinking it would matter. But it got out that the quiet kid who sat in the back of AP History worked at the Harrington estate. And once that was out, something shifted in the social mechanics of that year that I still don't fully understand, except that I became more visible in a way that felt immediately dangerous. The first incident was small. I was in the cafeteria getting a tray when Tyler walked past with 3 of his friends and said loudly enough for the table nearby to hear, "Don't forget to edge the south garden this weekend." The hedges are getting uneven." He said it with a smile, like it was a joke between friends, and his friends laughed, and he kept walking. I stood there with my tray and said nothing. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Teenagers say stupid things, Rich. Kids perform for each other. It wasn't personal, but it happened again. A week later, in the parking lot before school, Tyler was standing with a group near the entrance when I arrived on my bike. I was locking it to the rack, a cheap 10-speed I'd bought secondhand, when I heard him say, to no one in particular, "Rough commute?" Another laugh from the group. I locked my bike and walked past without looking at them. Then Madison got involved. She was more precise than her brother. Where Tyler relied on volume and audience, Madison worked with subtlety. She sat 2 rows ahead of me in AP English, and she started making comments in class. Never direct, always wrapped in plausible deniability. During a discussion about social mobility in The Great Gatsby, she turned slightly in her seat and said, "Some people just don't understand what it actually takes to maintain a certain standard of living." She wasn't looking at me. She didn't need to. The girl sitting next to me glanced over, and I kept my eyes on my notebook. There was a particular sequence in November that I think about more than any other. We had a school event, a fundraising dinner that the parents attended, one of those things where everyone dresses up and the school gym is transformed. And for one evening, Jefferson High looks like the kind of institution the families at the north end of the city actually wanted it to be. I wasn't going. I had never gone to that event. I didn't have the clothes for it, and I didn't have the $20 ticket price, and I had no reason to be there. But I was working that afternoon. Mr. Carter had asked me to stay late to help set up some exterior lighting on the Harrington property for an event they were hosting the following weekend, and by the time I was packing up my tools near the back gate, the family was coming out the front door in formal clothes to head to the school dinner. I was still in my work clothes, dusty jeans, a flannel shirt, old boots. Tyler saw me from across the driveway. He was wearing a blazer. He looked at me, then at his friends standing near the car, then back at me, and he smiled. "We'll leave the back gate open for you," he said, "in case you need to use it later." His friends laughed. His father was 20 feet away and heard it, and said nothing. That was the moment it went from a low-grade social cruelty to something I could feel in my chest. I want you to stop here for a second and think about what I was dealing with. I was 16 years old. I was working to help keep the lights on at home. I was trying to stay in school, keep my grades up, hold on to a job I needed. I had done nothing to these people, and they had decided, for reasons that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what I represented to them, that making me feel small was entertainment. What would you have done in my place? Put it in the comments, because I genuinely think about this. There were 3 options as I saw them then: quit the job, confront them, or endure it. I chose endurance. I've spent 20 years asking myself whether that was strength or cowardice, and I still don't have a clean answer. I kept the job. I kept my mouth shut. I kept going to school every morning and doing my work and not giving them the reaction they were angling for. And then, on a Wednesday afternoon in early December, everything changed. I was in the east wing of the house doing some repair work on a window latch, one of those maintenance tasks that requires you to be inside, in a part of the house you don't normally access. Mr. Carter had let me in through the service entrance and pointed me toward the east corridor. First floor, 3rd door on the right. The work took about 15 minutes. On my way back through the corridor to the service exit, I passed the door of what I would later understand was the father's private study. The door was not fully closed. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be absolutely clear about that, because what happened next changed everything, and I have never been able to separate the accident of that moment from the consequences it produced. I was walking past. I heard voices. I slowed down, not because I was curious about the family's private affairs, but because I heard a tone that made me careful, the way you slow down automatically when you hear something that signals tension. Tyler's voice, clipped and tense. "How bad is it actually?" A pause. Then a voice I recognized as the father's. Bad enough. The Westfield development is underwater. We're looking at losing the Portland holdings by spring if the interest rolls. Madison's voice quieter. Does Mom know? No, and she's not going to. We handle this internally. Tyler again. What does handle mean? Another pause, longer this time. It means we manage the perception, and we restructure before anyone external knows how exposed we are. The creditors are not going to come knocking if they think the core assets are stable. And are they stable? Silence. I had stopped walking. I was standing in the corridor 3 feet from a partially open door, hearing a conversation I had absolutely no business hearing, and my heart was going at a pace I could feel in my throat. I started moving again immediately, carefully, made it to the service exit, let myself out, walked to my bike, and rode home. I told no one. I wrote nothing down. I didn't process it into a plan or a strategy or anything at all. I was 16 years old, and what I had overheard was simply a piece of information I had nowhere to put, so I filed it away in the part of my mind where I stored things I didn't yet understand. 2 weeks later, on a Friday, I arrived for my afternoon shift, and Mr. Carter met me at the back gate with a different energy than usual. I need you to come inside, Dwight, he said. Not unkindly, but differently. I followed him into the house. The father was in the kitchen, and a large man, the kind of person who occupies a room more fully than the room seems designed for. He was wearing a suit. His expression was closed, deliberate, the face of someone who has already decided what is going to happen and is performing the announcement as a formality. Tyler was standing to the left, arms crossed. Madison was seated at the kitchen island, looking at her phone. There was a theft in this house, the father said. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked at a point slightly above my head. My watch collection and a substantial amount of cash from my study were taken sometime in the last week. We've reviewed who has had access to that part of the house. He paused. You were seen entering the study corridor. The room was very quiet, I said. I was in the east corridor, repairing a window latch. Mr. Carter assigned the work. I didn't go into any room, except the one I was assigned. The father looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at me with steady, flat eyes. I saw you come out of the study. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't know anything was missing. It was so clean, so practiced. The tone, the timing, the specific choice of, I didn't say anything at the time, as if he had been thoughtful and generous to wait. I looked at Madison. She had not looked up from her phone. I wasn't in the study, I said. My voice was level. I was 16 years old, and I was terrified, and I was keeping my voice level through something I did not yet have a name for, but would later recognize as the specific anger that comes from being accused of something by someone who knows you didn't do it. The father said, I'm not going to call the police. You're young, and I don't want to destroy your future over a mistake. But you're not coming back to this property. Mr. Carter will settle what we owe you through today. He looked at Mr. Carter. 2 weeks. I started to speak again, and Mr. Carter put a hand briefly on my shoulder, not roughly, more like a signal. I stopped. Mr. Carter paid me out of a small envelope he had been holding. 2 weeks of pay, counted out in bills. The father had already left the kitchen. Tyler was still standing with his arms crossed, watching me with that same flat expression. Madison had still not looked up. I took the money. I walked to the back gate. I got on my bike. I rode home. I don't remember the ride. I remember the moment I got into the apartment and my mother asked me what had happened, because she could see from my face that something had, and I told her the short version. I lost the job. They accused me of stealing. It wasn't true. And she sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a long time before she said anything. What she said was, Are you okay? Not, how could this happen, or what did you do, or we need the money. Just that. I nodded because I couldn't trust my voice to produce words. Then she said, then it doesn't matter what they think. And I knew she meant it, and I knew she was wrong, but I let it stand because she needed to say it. I went to my room and sat on the edge of my bed. and I did not cry. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me seem strong, but because I think it tells you something about the specific kind of damage that was already done at that point. I was too far past a certain kind of hurt to cry. I was in a colder place. A place where you start calculating rather than feeling. I thought about what I had heard in the corridor, the debts, the Portland holdings, the creditors. I thought about the watches and the cash. I thought about the timing, 2 weeks after I'd overheard that conversation. I thought about what it would mean to them, on a purely practical level, to have someone take the blame for a missing amount of money when they were trying to manage the perception of their finances. I was 16 and I had no framework for what I was seeing, yet, but the shape of it was already there. I didn't do anything with the realization. What was I going to do? Go back to the father and say, "Actually, I think your children stole from you and framed me because I accidentally overheard your financial problems?" I had nothing but an overheard conversation and my own word, which, as the last hour had clearly demonstrated, counted for exactly nothing against the word of people with money and standing, and a house with a fountain in the driveway. By Monday the rumor was, at school. I don't know how it traveled so fast. Looking back, I think Tyler told one person, and that person told everyone within a day. But at the time, the speed of it felt almost physical, like a pressure that was everywhere at once. By Monday morning, students I had known since middle school were making deliberate decisions about where to stand in relation to me. Not loudly. No one was throwing things or shouting. It was quieter and more thorough than that. It was the social version of a perimeter. People who had been neutral toward me before suddenly had somewhere else to be when I walked by. A girl I'd worked on a project with the month before looked through me in the hallway like I wasn't there. Teachers were more careful, not hostile, not overtly suspicious, but I would catch a particular pause when my name came up in class, a slight recalibration of expression. One teacher held me back after class, Mr. Bennett, who taught chemistry, and asked me very carefully if there was anything going on at home. I said no. He didn't push it, but the fact that he asked at all told me the story had traveled further than the student body. My guidance counselor called me in and asked about my plans for the following year. I had been on track for a strong college application. My grades were solid. I'd been working on a short list of schools with financial aid programs. The counselor, a woman in her 40s who had always been professionally encouraging, was suddenly less specific. She used phrases like, "Let's be realistic," and "there are some very good local programs," and she didn't make eye contact in the direct way she had before. I sat through that meeting and said very little. Walking out of her office, I stood in the hallway for a moment and understood, clearly and without any room for denial, that the accusation, which was false, which everyone in that kitchen had known was false, had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had taken a person who had been slowly, carefully building toward something, and made that something almost unreachable without anyone having to do anything more. Just a word, just a label, just one family's decision to choose the easiest available target. I thought about quitting school, not in a dramatic way, more in the practical way you think about any option when the other options seem to be closing. If school was not going to be the door I had believed it was, then every hour I spent there was an hour I could spend working. I was already working. After losing the Harrington job, I had picked up shifts at a grocery warehouse, night work, physically brutal, but consistently available. The math was simple enough to be tempting. I didn't quit. My mother never told me not to. She didn't need to. I had watched her go to work with raw hands every morning for 9 years, and I understood, without any conversation, that quitting was not a thing she would respect, and therefore not a thing I could allow myself to do. So I finished. Not triumphantly, not with some dramatic last chapter revelation. I finished the same way I had operated for years, quietly, consistently, without calling attention to myself. My grades were good enough for a college application, not as good as they had been before December, because the last 5 months of that year I was running on a kind of damaged autopilot that limited everything, including academic performance. But good enough. I applied to 2 schools, both state universities with financial aid programs. I got into one. The financial aid package covered most of tuition if I maintained a certain GPA. Housing was not covered. I found a room in a shared house near campus, 3 other students, a bathroom that was always damp, a kitchen with a broken burner that the landlord never fixed. I worked 30 hours a week, mostly late shifts at a restaurant near campus, clearing tables, washing dishes, occasionally covering the bar prep work if they were short. I had chosen finance. People sometimes ask me later, why finance? I always give the version of the answer that sounds considered and professional. The reality was simpler and less flattering. I chose finance because I'd stood in a corridor at 16 years old and overheard a conversation about debt structures and asset management and creditor perceptions, and I had understood, in the way you understand something that bypasses logic and lands directly in the gut, that the language of money was a language of power, and that the only people who operated without fear in the world I had observed were the people who understood that language natively. I wanted to understand it better than anyone in that room had understood it. The weeks after the firing moved differently than the weeks before. Time in the preceding months had been structured around work shifts and school schedules and the practical rhythm of a life where there was always a next thing to do. After the Harrington house, time acquired a kind of unstructured weight. I had the warehouse job, which I picked up within a week of losing the estate position, but it ran mostly from 10 at night until 4 in the morning, and the days were open in a way that felt less like freedom than like a hollow space I hadn't earned. I went to school, I did my work, I sat in the back of AP History and AP English, and stared at the board and produced the assignments and the test scores that the assignments and tests required, but something in the mechanical quality of my functioning had changed, and I could feel it even if I couldn't name it precisely at the time. I was going through the motions with less in me than there had been before. Not depression exactly, though maybe it was exactly that, and I simply didn't have the vocabulary at 16 to identify it as such. More like a switch that had been flipped in the circuitry that governs effort, the part of you that makes you reach rather than simply extend. The social aftermath was the most immediately concrete. I had not been socially dominant before the accusation. I was the quiet kid, the worker, the one who kept his head down, but I had existed within a recognizable human network. There were people who acknowledged me, people I had collaborated with on group projects, a girl named Haley who sat next to me in chemistry and would sometimes turn around and ask me what I'd gotten on a problem set. Nothing close, nothing deep, but the normal, low-grade human connectivity that school provides as a background condition. After December, that evaporated. Haley stopped turning around. The group project partners from the first semester were suddenly organizing themselves differently when third semester groups were assigned. I was not excluded with any dramatic ceremony. It was lighter and more damaging than that. I was simply not included, the way a word stops being used when the context for it goes away. I sat alone at lunch for the remainder of the year. I spoke when called on in class, and not otherwise. I watched the social life of Jefferson High from a middle distance, the way you observe the weather from inside a building where the heat has gone out. The guidance counselor meeting I mentioned, the one with the suddenly less specific language about my prospects, produced another consequence I hadn't anticipated. She had shared something discreetly with one of the scholarship committee members, a teacher who coordinated a local foundation's awards for graduating seniors. I found out about this only because a classmate, a boy named Jason Walker, who was on the newspaper and who had a journalist's congenital need to tell people things they didn't know, found me in the hallway one afternoon and said, with a combination of awkwardness and what I think was genuine uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing, that he had overheard a conversation in the faculty lounge that suggested my name had been quietly flagged on the scholarship committee roster. Flagged how? I asked. Jason looked at the locker behind my left ear and said, flagged like they were suggesting you might be a higher risk candidate than your grades indicate. Higher risk candidate. The phrase had a specific grammar. It wasn't about my grades or my test scores or my application essay. It was the language of someone who had been given a piece of information secondhand and unverified, and had decided to protect the institution from the possibility of embarrassment. I thanked Jason for telling me and walked to the bathroom at the end of the hall and stood over the sink for approximately 2 minutes. Not crying, not breaking, just standing there, letting the specific weight of what was happening land fully, because I'd learned from my mother that the worst thing you can do with a hard reality is refuse to look at it directly. The scholarship I had been planning to apply for was significant, not life-changing on its own, but it would have made the first year of university manageable in a way that would have freed up hours I would eventually need to spend working. Losing it, which I did not even apply, because I understood from Jason's information that the result was predetermined, meant an additional 12 to 15 hours of work per week for the entirety of my freshman year. That was 12 to 15 hours of sleep, study, or recovery that disappeared from my life for a year because a guidance counselor had made a call she had no factual basis for making. That scholarship was the most concrete, most measurable thing the accusation cost me in the short term. I've thought about it often, not because I'm still angry about it, the anger burnt to a specific residue years ago, but because it's the clearest illustration of how these things work. Tyler and Madison Harrington needed a scapegoat for one afternoon. They needed 30 seconds of a false accusation. The cost of those 30 seconds for me was 12 to 15 additional hours of work per week for a year, a specific degradation in academic performance during a critical period, and a social repositioning that shaped the entire final chapter of my high school experience. They never thought about any of that. I'm certain of it. People like them never do the math on the costs they assign to others. Why would they? They operate in a world where their own costs are managed by the assets and status they were born with, and where the costs they create for others belong to a category of experience they've never had reason to understand. I graduated in June. My GPA was lower than it had been in November. Still good enough. Still within the range that got me into the state university. Still enough to make the financial aid package viable, but not what it should have been, not what it would have been. My mother came to the graduation ceremony. She sat in the 4th row and wore a blue dress I didn't recognize, something she must have purchased specifically for the occasion, which I understood as a statement about what the day meant to her, even though she would never have said it directly. When I walked across the stage and took my diploma and came down the other side, I looked for her in the 4th row, and she was standing and clapping, and her face was the face of someone for whom this moment was everything that years of raw hands and early mornings and a husband who left were supposed to amount to. I held it together until we were outside, and then I didn't. Briefly, and she didn't say anything, just put a hand on my arm. We went to a diner and had pancakes. It was the best graduation dinner I can imagine. The university was 300 miles from everything I had known, which was exactly as far as I needed it to be, and not far enough to feel like escape. You don't escape something that lives inside you. You just move it to a different address. My first week I got lost twice, getting to the finance building. Not because the campus was complicated, it wasn't, but because I had arrived carrying a kind of attentional fog that comes from years of operating on compressed sleep and compressed emotion, and in the absence of the immediate pressures that had structured every day for the last 3 years, I found myself momentarily unable to function without them. I was disoriented by the absence of urgency, the way a person who has been running a fever for a long time is disoriented by the absence of it. The normal temperature feels wrong. I found the finance building on my own, on the 3rd attempt. It was a gray stone structure on the east side of campus, slightly removed from the more social cluster of buildings in the central quad, which I found immediately appropriate. It smelled like carpet and printer ink. The hallways were lined with glass cases, full of academic awards and the headshots of faculty members who had published in journals I had not yet read. I stood in front of those cases for a long time, not with awe exactly, more with the specific attention you pay to a map when you've been moving without one. Professor Hayes's introductory class met on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9 in the morning in a lecture hall on the third floor that held about 60 students. I arrived at the first class 20 minutes early and sat in the third row, which was close enough to see the board clearly and far enough from the front that it wasn't conspicuous. By the time the class started, the room was full and loud in the way that first classes are loud. The pre-semester social performance, the reunions of people who had spent the summer in the same circles, the loud performances of casual ease. I sat in my row and looked at the board. Professor Hayes walked in 2 minutes before 9. She set her bag on the table at the front, pulled out her notes, and looked at the room over her reading glasses with an expression that communicated, clearly and without warmth or hostility, that the performance happening around her was not her concern. She waited until exactly 9 o'clock. Then she said, "Here is what I want you to understand before we begin. The money in your bank account, if you have one, is not wealth. The assets your family owns, if they own any, are not security. Numbers on a screen are not power. Understanding how the machines that generate and destroy those numbers actually operate, that is power. That is what we are going to learn, and most of you will not find it comfortable." She paused. "Good. That means you're paying attention." I wrote every word of that down. The first semester coursework was everything I had hoped for, and nothing I had expected. I had understood finance, going in, as a language, a set of terms and structures and relationships that, once learned, would give me access to a form of understanding that had been unavailable to me. What I had not expected was that the language, once you started learning it, was alive. It was not a fixed system of rules. It was a living argument between competing principles, liquidity and return, risk and stability, short-term pressure and long-term value, and the argument was never settled, only navigated, by people who understood the terms of the debate well enough to function within it. I found this genuinely thrilling. I had not expected to be thrilled by anything in particular. I had expected to be competent, and to work, and to build. The thrill was unexpected, and it mattered. It meant the work was not only obligation. It had a quality of aliveness that I had not felt consistently in anything since before the Harrington House. I went to Professor Hayes's office hours in the third week of class. The office was small and organized with the precision of someone who spent most of their time in it, and she was sitting at a desk covered in papers when I knocked, and she looked up and said, "You're the one who stayed after on Wednesday." I said yes. She said, "The question you asked about the relationship between leverage ratios and operational cash constraints was more sophisticated than this level of coursework requires. Where did that come from?" I said it came from something I had observed when I was younger, a conversation I had overheard about a family's financial situation, and that I had spent several years thinking about what the terms I'd heard actually meant. She looked at me with the kind of attention that good teachers give when they are recalibrating. She said, "Come every week." I came every week. By the end of first semester, I had also found 2 other things that would matter. The library, which was open until midnight and had research databases that gave me access to decades of industry case studies and academic literature, and a part-time job in the university's administrative offices doing data entry that paid better than the restaurant work, and had the specific advantage of being physically stationary so I could think while I worked. The library became my real classroom, not instead of the formal courses. I took those seriously and attended everything. But, in addition to them, I read case studies of real corporate failures, going back to the 70s. I read the academic research on bankruptcy mechanics and restructuring outcomes. I read biographies of financial practitioners I had never heard of, people who had built careers inside the machinery I was learning about, and I paid attention not to their success stories, but to the moments they described having been wrong, because being wrong in a technically precise field was where the real information lived. I was reading a case study late in the library on a Thursday in February of sophomore year when a student named Logan, the same Logan who was my housemate, the pre-med insomniac, sat down across from me and looked at the material I was working with and said, with genuine curiosity, "Is that for a class?" I said no. He said, "Then why are you reading it?" I said, "Because I need to know it." He looked at me for a moment. Then he went back to his anatomy textbook. But the quality of that exchange, the recognition it contained, one person who was working compulsively acknowledging another, was the closest thing to connection I had in those early months, and I found it unexpectedly warming. Logan and I developed an arrangement over the following year. We did not become close friends in any conventional sense. We were two people who occupied the same library tables at the same late hours, because we were both running towards something the same way and found the parallel company more comfortable than being alone. We never discussed our motivations. We barely discussed anything personal. But we were in each other's peripheral vision through most of 2 years, and there is a particular form of companionship in that. The simple acknowledgement that someone else is also still up at midnight, working toward a thing that matters to them, that I did not take for granted. The Dr. Morgan mistake I've described in its broad shape, but the texture of it was more instructive than the summary. Jason Morgan, I will use his full name because he deserves it, he was not a bad person, just a contingent one, was one of those academics who carried the professional world with him into the classroom in a way that most professors in their full-time academic mode cannot. He had the vocabulary of practice. He spoke about cases the way a practitioner speaks about them, with the specific details and the honest acknowledgement of complexity that you don't get from textbook presentations. I was drawn to him for those reasons, and I made the error of converting that draw into a structural dependency. I organized my entire professional positioning around a single point of access. This was, in retrospect, a version of the same error I had made before the Harrington House. The belief that if you worked hard enough within one relationship, one system, one channel, the return would be proportional to the investment. The belief that effort and alignment produce security. They don't, not by themselves. What they produce is quality. Quality needs distribution. When Dr. Morgan left in March, I was in his office within 2 days of the announcement, not pleading but asking, directly, was there anything he could do to extend the introduction to Meridian before he left? He looked at me with the specific discomfort of someone who has made a commitment implicitly and is now having to acknowledge that the implicit commitment is being dissolved by circumstances. He said he would make a call. He made the call. The call did not result in anything concrete. I spent 3 days being angry, not at him, at myself, for having built on a foundation that could be dissolved by a single person's departure. Then I stopped being angry and started working. The summer at the data processing company was physically uninspiring and professionally instructive in ways I had not anticipated. The company processed financial data for mid-sized regional lenders. It was not glamorous work, and the systems were outdated, and the people around me were largely doing the job for the paycheck rather than out of any particular interest in the work. But the data itself was real. I was handling actual loan files, actual credit records, actual financial history of actual businesses. I was looking at the raw material of what I was studying at the theoretical level in my courses, and even in its most administrative form, the texture of real financial data was more instructive than any simulation. I also watched, at that company, what it looked like when an organization's operations were running on systems that had stopped serving the organization's actual needs. The data processing systems were outdated by about a decade. The procedures were built around those outdated systems and had not been updated to reflect what the systems were actually capable of. Everyone knew this. No one had done anything about it. The cost of the inefficiency was distributed across hundreds of small daily frictions that no single person felt urgently enough to fix. This was the first time I saw, concretely, what deferred maintenance looked like in an organizational context. It would not be the last. It would, in fact, turn out to be the single most common thing I encountered in my restructuring work. Companies that had known for years that something needed to change and had chosen, day by day, not to change it. until the accumulated cost of not changing became a crisis. Senior year, I had 4 internship leads, as I've mentioned. The 2 I took were different in character and complementary in what they taught me. The fall semester internship was at a small commercial lender, community scale, focused on local business clients, where I spent 3 months doing credit underwriting. I sat with loan officers and listened to how they talked about businesses seeking capital. I read credit memos. I learned the specific vocabulary of risk assessment at the transactional level, how a lender looks at a small business owner and decides whether the story the owner is telling about their business is credible. The spring internship was at a larger firm, a regional advisory practice that did a range of financial consulting work, including some restructuring. The work was less detailed. I was an intern. I was doing research and preparation work rather than the substantive analysis, but the exposure to the culture of the practice was valuable. I watched how senior practitioners carried themselves in client meetings. I watched how they communicated complexity to clients who were not technically sophisticated. I watched how they managed the tension between what was analytically correct and what the client could hear. I filed all of this away. I graduated on a Saturday in May. My mother drove 300 miles and sat in the bleachers in her good dress, and I walked across the stage and she was standing again, the same way she had stood at my high school graduation, and I felt the same thing I had felt that time, the weight of what that standing meant, the years behind it, the specific costs she had carried to make it to this moment. We went to a diner again. Different diner, different city, same order, coffee and pancakes and not much conversation. She looked at me across the table and said, "Now what?" I said, "Now I go to work." She said, "You've been going to work since you were 14. I said, "Now I go to the right work." She stirred her coffee. "You sure you know what that is?" I thought about it. "Yeah," I said, "I'm sure." She nodded and went back to her pancakes, and that was the extent of our graduation conversation, and it was exactly right. The credit analysis firm was called Vantage Credit Partners, a name that communicated ambition without specificity, which was fitting because the firm itself occupied that space between where it had come from and where it was trying to go. 40 employees, a good regional reputation, clients that were mostly mid-sized lenders and corporate borrowers who needed somebody to tell them what their exposure actually looked like. I was hired as a junior analyst at a salary I will not name because the number was slightly embarrassing in the context of a finance degree, and I do not want that number to be the first thing you focus on. What I will say is that it covered my rent, my food, my professional development expenses, and a small monthly contribution to my mother's household, and it did not cover much else. And this was fine because there was not much else I was trying to cover. My supervisor was a man named Eric Simmons, mid-40s, 16 years in credit analysis, the kind of practitioner who had been doing the work long enough that his expertise had become largely invisible to him. He knew things that he no longer knew he knew, which made him both excellent at the work and occasionally difficult to learn from, because the steps had collapsed into intuition. He was not an enthusiastic teacher. He was, however, a completely honest one. When I produced work that was incorrect, he told me it was incorrect, and he told me specifically how and why, without softening the feedback to spare my feelings. I valued this more than I could have explained at the time. I had spent years in environments where the truth was managed, softened, redirected. Straightforward professional correction felt like integrity, and in the context of what I had been dealing with since I was 16, integrity in any form was something I gravitated toward like a plant toward light. My first major solo assignment came 8 months in. A regional manufacturing company, 50 employees, had applied for a credit facility to fund equipment replacement. Standard underwriting request. My job was to analyze the financial statements, assess the debt service coverage, review the collateral, and produce a recommendation. I spent 2 weeks on it, considerably longer than the assignment warranted, because I wanted to be certain. Every calculation checked and rechecked, every assumption documented, every risk factor named explicitly. The recommendation was a conditional approval with specific covenant requirements. Eric reviewed it and said, "This is thorough." That was the complete sentence, no further elaboration. I recognized it as the equivalent of enthusiastic praise in his register and filed it accordingly. The recommendation was accepted by the client and the loan was approved. 18 months later, the company returned for an expansion facility. One of the senior partners came to my desk and said, "They asked for you specifically." This had not happened to any other analyst of my tenure in the firm's recent history, according to Eric's later offhand comment. I took the second engagement and produced a second recommendation, and it was accepted and the loan closed without incident. This was not a landmark. This was not the kind of story anyone tells at industry conferences. It was simply two small instances of the work being done correctly, and the result being confidence from the client. But those two small instances produced a third engagement, and the third produced a fourth, and by the end of my second year, I had a portfolio of clients who returned to me specifically, which was the only reliable signal in the early stages of a financial career that you were building something real rather than simply occupying a position. My first promotion came with a note from the managing partner, a woman named Allison Cooper who ran the firm with the combination of warmth and precision that the best managers employ. That said, in its entirety, Vantage values analysts who build trust faster than their title warrants. I kept that note for years, not for sentimental reasons, but because the specific formulation of it was instructive. Building trust faster than your title warrants, not faster than your expertise warrants. Faster than your title warrants. The distinction mattered. Title is a shortcut. It tells people how much attention to pay you before they have evidence of whether attention is warranted. If you build trust before your title commands it, you have created a different kind of relationship, one based on evidence rather than position. That is a more durable kind of relationship, and also, I would learn, a more useful one. Because when things go wrong in a complex situation, the relationships that hold are the ones built on demonstrated judgment, not the ones built on formal authority. I transferred to the larger firm at 30. The increase in salary was real, and the increase in case complexity was real. And I handled the transition by doing exactly what I had done at every previous step, arriving early, leaving late, reading everything, and producing work of a quality that made the question of my seniority relative to others irrelevant in practical terms. The second firm was called Meridian Strategy Group, which I mention because the name Meridian appeared in my professional life for the second time, and this time I was arriving on my own terms rather than as a dependent of someone else's connection. I had not set out to return to the Meridian name. It was coincidence. But I noticed it and found it satisfying in a small, private way. The kind of satisfaction that comes from recognizing that circumstances that once blocked you have become circumstances you move through. At Meridian, I was on the restructuring team. The work was more complex, larger companies, larger debt loads, more creditor groups, more competing interests. I was learning case management at the level where the analytical work and the relational work began to require each other. You could produce a technically perfect analysis and have it ignored because the stakeholders who needed to accept it didn't trust you. Trust at this scale was not built through individual competence alone. It was built through repeated presence. Showing up to every meeting, answering every question directly and without evasion, never over-promising on the analysis and always delivering on the promise. This was where I began to develop the specific quality of professional presence that Sarah Bennett would later observe and describe, in her way, as reliable in a way that creates its own kind of authority. Not charisma, not performance. The authority of someone you have learned, over time, to believe. My second major promotion at Meridian was into a lead analyst role on a significant case. A hospitality company with over $300 million in secured debt, multiple property assets, and a creditor group that was deeply fragmented and actively hostile to each other. The case had stalled before I was assigned to lead it, partly because the previous analyst had been producing technically acceptable work that no one trusted enough to act on, and partly because the creditor dynamics were genuinely complicated by years of bad relationships between the parties. I spent my first month on the case doing something that was not technically analysis at all. I met individually with each member of the creditor group, 11 separate entities, ranging from a major bank to a small regional fund that held a junior tranche. And I listened to what each of them said they needed. Not what the financial model said they should accept, what they said they needed. Then I went back and looked at whether there was a structure that satisfied those stated needs without violating the mathematics, and found, to my own surprise, that there was. The structure required 3 separate negotiating sessions that I personally facilitated, and it required me to say things in those sessions that made people uncomfortable, including one instance where I told the representative of the primary bank that their stated position was inconsistent with their fiduciary obligations to their own depositors, and that if they wanted me to produce a recommendation that would hold up to scrutiny, they would need to revisit it. He did not enjoy hearing this. He came back 2 days later and revised the position. The case closed in 7 months. It set a record for the firm's fastest resolution on a case of that debt scale. Allison Cooper from my first firm, who had heard about the result through the industry, sent me a note that said simply, "I told you." I was 33. I had been working in finance for 8 years. I had never once thought, consciously and deliberately, about the Harrington House as a motivating factor. It was there, the way the original wound is always there, shaping things without being named. But I was not running toward it. I was running toward the work itself, which had become its own sufficient reason. The Sarah Bennett conference encounter I described earlier deserves a postscript that I didn't include in the initial telling. After our 40-minute conversation at the conference, and before she made the offer 6 months later, I received a call from someone at Apex, asking if I would be willing to participate in a case review as a technical consultant. A 1-day engagement, separate from any employment consideration, reviewing the analytical framework on a complex multi-jurisdictional restructuring that Apex was midway through. I said yes, cleared a day from my Meridian calendar, and went to the Apex offices. The work was a case review, reading through the analysis framework and identifying any structural weaknesses before the final recommendation was prepared. I spent the day reading everything, and at the end of the day produced a written memo with 12 observations, 4 of which were technical corrections, and 8 of which were structural refinements that would improve the recommendation's resilience to creditor challenge. Sarah read the memo in the meeting room while I was still there. She read it with the focused attention of someone who is actually reading rather than performing reading. When she finished, she looked up and said, "How long did this take you?" I said, "About 6 hours for the reading and 2 for the memo." She said, "Most practitioners at your level would have taken 2 days on the reading alone." I said, "I've been reading financial documents for 8 years. Speed comes from pattern recognition." She said, "The 4 technical corrections are right. 6 of the 8 structural observations are right. The other 2 I disagree with, but I can see the argument." I said, "Which 2 do you disagree with?" she told me. We spent 40 minutes discussing them. At the end of the discussion I said she was right on one, and I maintained my position on the other. She looked at me with an expression I would later recognize as the specific expression she reserved for people she was deciding to trust. The offer came 6 months later. There is something specific I want to tell you about the early Apex years that I have not mentioned yet, because it doesn't fit cleanly into the professional narrative, but it shapes what the professional narrative means. In my first year at Apex, Sarah assigned me to assist on a case involving a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwest. 160 employees, third-generation family ownership. The owners, a father and 2 adult sons, had made a series of acquisitions in the years before the recession that left them with a debt load they could not service once orders dropped. The primary lender, a regional bank, was pushing for liquidation. The case had been marked, before Sarah picked it up, as essentially resolved. liquidation pathway, asset sale, business closed. Sarah did not accept the essentially resolved framing. She sent me in to do a full analysis, and I spent 3 weeks inside that company's operations and financials before I came back with a recommendation. The recommendation was a prepackaged restructuring that preserved 60% of employment, satisfied the bank at approximately 78 cents on the dollar over 3 years, and gave the owners a path to survival in a reduced form. The bank's initial reaction was to push back. They preferred the certainty of liquidation at 55 cents on the dollar to the uncertainty of a restructuring at 78 cents over time. This is a common dynamic. People with immediate optionality often prefer the worse certain outcome to the better uncertain one. Sarah and I spent 2 days presenting, answering questions, and essentially explaining the math until the math became undeniable. The bank agreed to the restructuring. The company survived. I went back twice over the following year to review the progress. On my second visit, the plant manager, a man in his mid-50s who had worked there for 22 years, walked me through the floor and at the end shook my hand and said simply, "Thank you." Not effusive, not a speech, just 2 words, from a man who had 3 children and a mortgage and had been 3 weeks from having no job. I thought about that handshake for a long time. It was the first time in my career that the work had produced something that connected, visibly and directly, to something human, rather than purely numerical. Not that the numerical work was less important. The numerical work was the mechanism by which the human outcome was possible, but the handshake was the thing that told me what the numbers were for. I had been operating for years in the abstraction of financial analysis, and that handshake landed me in the concrete reality of what it meant. I didn't change the way I worked after that. I was already thorough, I was already rigorous. But I changed what I understood my work to be for, at the deepest level, and that understanding sat beneath the technical practice from then on, like a foundation I could trust. I thought about my mother's hands. I thought about Mr. Carter, who had paid me out of an envelope and put a hand briefly on my shoulder to stop me from making the situation worse for myself, and who had treated me like a person capable of doing the work. There are people in your history who treat you with basic decency when they have no particular reason to, when it costs them nothing and earns them nothing, and you remember them with a specific kind of gratitude that's different from the gratitude you feel toward people who make large gestures. Smaller, more durable. I have thought about Mr. Carter more than I have thought about the Harrington children, and I think that tells you something true about how the world actually works. The relationship with Paige Turner deserves more than the brief mentions I have given it, because it was the most real personal relationship of my adult life, and its ending was one of the things that clarified, more than anything else could have, what the long years of driven isolation had actually produced. I met Paige at a legal conference I attended because Sarah told me to. It was the kind of event where the restructuring world and the legal world overlap. Insolvency practitioners and corporate attorneys, people whose work touched at certain points, and who needed to know each other without needing to be friends. I was there to build the professional network that the Dr. Morgan situation had taught me I couldn't afford to neglect, and Paige was there representing a corporate law firm, where she was a 4th-year associate. We met over bad conference center coffee and spent 45 minutes talking about a recent federal court decision on crammed-down mechanics in Chapter 11 proceedings. She knew the case as well as I did, which was unusual. Most of the people I talked with at these events had partial knowledge, enough to sound informed, not enough to be useful. Paige had the full picture and was applying it to something she was working on, a litigation issue with a restructuring angle, and our conversation became the kind of working conversation where time disappears, because the problem is real and the thinking is good. She called me 2 weeks later about a related question on another case. I answered the question with more detail than she strictly needed, because I found I was glad she had called. That recognition that I was glad was unusual enough that I noticed it. We had dinner once a week for 3 months before I understood that they were dates. This is not a story I tell with pride. It is an illustration of the specific social blindness that comes from spending your formative years at such a distance from normal human connection that you lose the calibration for recognizing it when it arrives. Paige eventually named it. She was direct in the way that people are direct when they have been patient long enough and are no longer willing to wait for the slower person in the conversation to arrive. She said, over dinner, "I need to know if you understand that we've been on 12 dates." I said, "I know." She looked at me. I said, "I didn't know how to say it first." She said, "Why not?" I said, "I'm not good at this." She said, "You're very good at what you do. You're good at thinking. You're good at reading situations. You have excellent judgment." She paused. "You are not good at being in a room with another person without managing the distance." I didn't have a response to that, partly because she was right, partly because she had said it with a quality of directness that was not unkind. She was not describing a failure. She was describing a thing she had observed carefully and found important enough to name. We were together, after that, for nearly 2 years. It was the longest I had maintained any personal relationship as an adult. Not because I'd tried harder with Paige than with others. I hadn't had others, not in any real sense, a fact that I recognized as part of the pattern she was naming, but because she had the combination of intelligence and patience and directness that made her able to navigate the distance without needing me to pretend it wasn't there, while simultaneously making it clear, consistently and without drama, that she would not indefinitely accept that it was permanent. When she left, the ending was not dramatic. There was no final argument. It was a conversation that had been building for 3 months, and that both of us understood was coming. She said the thing about being competent and unreachable. She also said something else that I haven't mentioned yet and that I've been carrying since. She said, "Whatever it is you're still trying to prove, I hope you get to prove it. And I hope when you do, you find out it was worth it. Because I think you're not sure, and I think that uncertainty is eating something in you." I stood at my apartment door and watched her go, and I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was equal to what she had just said. There was a period in my mid-30s, I was 35, 36, when I came closest to losing the thread that had been keeping me moving, not a breakdown, nothing cinematic, more like a sustained low-pressure system that sat over everything for about 18 months and made it harder than usual to find reasons that felt sufficient. The professional success was real by then. The reputation was established. I was making enough money that I had stopped thinking about money as the primary constraint on my choices, which was a condition so different from my first 25 years that it still occasionally surprised me. I had the apartment, I had the work, I had the industry conferences and the case files, and the particular satisfaction that comes from being one of the most reliable people in your field. What I didn't have was a clear next thing to orient toward. This sounds trivial stated flatly like that. It was not trivial. The entire structure of how I had moved through the world since I was 12 was oriented toward a next thing. The next job, the next degree, the next promotion, the next case, the next level of the work. The engine had always had a destination in view, and the having a destination had been, functionally, what kept everything operating. At 35, for the first time in my adult life, I looked around and the destination was not visible, and the engine was still running. I didn't know what to do with that. I worked more. That was my default response to most conditions, and it was available to me, and it generated the familiar feeling of forward motion, even when the direction was not clear. I took on 2 cases simultaneously when 1 was standard, and 3 was the outer limit of what was manageable. I traveled more for the work. Site visits that could have been phone calls, in-person reviews that weren't strictly necessary, but created the sensation of movement. Sarah noticed and didn't say anything directly, which was her way of flagging concern without triggering the specific defensiveness she had learned over our years of working together was one of my reliable responses to being observed in a moment of difficulty. Then she did say something. At a partnership dinner in February of the year I turned 36. We were having coffee after dinner, and the others had drifted into conversation with each other, and she looked at me in the way she occasionally looked at me when she had decided to use the actual conversation rather than the professional one, and she said, "When's the last time you took a vacation?" I told her I had taken 4 days in October. She said, "When's the last time you took a vacation where you didn't work for 3 of the 4 days?" I thought about it. She said, "I'm going to need you to answer that question honestly." I said, "I don't know." She said, "Before you answer the next question I'm going to ask, I want you to hear that this is coming from care and not from criticism." She paused. "What are you still running toward?" I looked at my coffee cup. She said, "You don't have to answer me, but you should answer it." I didn't answer it. Not to her, not that night. But the question sat with me in the way that well-placed questions do, not immediately resolved, not set aside cleanly, but turning, slowly, in the back of everything for the weeks that followed. What was I still running toward? The honest answer, which I arrived at over the course of many weeks of quiet examination, was that I was still running toward the thing that was done in a kitchen when I was 16. Not consciously, not in the sense of a daily intention, but in the structural sense, in the way that a building's shape is determined not by a current decision, but by the original placement of the foundation. I had laid the foundation at 16, and the building had been going up ever since, and everything I had built was technically sound and genuinely accomplished, and also, fundamentally, organized around that original stone. Sarah had asked the right question. I didn't know what I was still running toward because I had never stopped running long enough to check whether the destination I had set out for was still the right one. The Harrington case arrived about 3 years after that dinner. Between that conversation and the case, there was more work. The Page-Turner relationship and its ending, a sabbatical I finally took, a real one, 3 weeks in the Northwest, mostly hiking, mostly alone, which was clarifying in the way that solitude becomes clarifying when you've been avoiding it, and a gradual settling in me of some of the low-pressure weight that had been sitting over everything. I came back from the sabbatical different, in a small but specific way, less driven by the engine and more able to sit with the fact of what I had built, more able to recognize, on a given Tuesday, that the work was genuinely good work and that its value didn't depend on it being oriented toward anything beyond itself. That recognition was fragile. It was not a permanent state. It didn't show up every day, but it was available, and available was better than absent. I was in that better state, more or less, when the Harrington file arrived. It is important to me that you understand this, because it affects the nature of what happened at the final meeting and in the months after. I was not, by the time I sat across from Tyler Harrington at that first case meeting, a man who had been consumed for 23 years by a specific grievance. I was a man who had built a life, had done good work, had paid significant costs, and had arrived at a version of himself that was functional and clear-eyed and professionally excellent, carrying a wound that was healed enough to work around, but not healed enough to have forgotten its original location. That specificity matters, because the way I conducted myself in that case, the precision, the integrity, the decision to do the job completely and correctly, and to let the truth be what it was, came from that place, not from burning grievance, from professional clarity, shaped by experience, informed at the base level by an old pain that I had learned to use correctly. The detail of the investigation itself deserves attention because it is where the technical story and the personal story intersect most completely, and I want to be accurate about the experience of that intersection. The Harrington Records Archive occupied 3 rooms on the lower level of their office building. Physical files, organized by year, going back 40 years in some cases. The company had a history, and the history was in boxes, and I needed the boxes. Derek Cooper arranged for me to have access with a staff member present, and I spent the better part of 3 weeks systematically reviewing files that no one had looked at in a decade. The physical act of working through those archives was different from any other due diligence I'd conducted, and the difference was not professional. It was atmospheric. When you work through the records of a company in the present tense, the documents are current instruments in an active process. When you work through records from 20 years ago, there is a quality of excavation. You are recovering something rather than analyzing it, and the recovery is its own kind of experience. I found records of things that had nothing to do with my case or my history. Business decisions from the father's era, some shrewd, some questionable, the complete complex picture of a real business, rather than the simplified version I had constructed in my memory. The Harrington family, seen through decades of corporate documentation, was a full human enterprise. Smart in some ways, careless in others, occasionally genuinely creative and occasionally genuinely self-destructive, in the pattern that characterizes most businesses and most families. I am telling you this because it would be dishonest to present the discovery of the transfer records as a clear and simple moment of vindication without acknowledging the complexity of the context in which it occurred. I had been living inside their history for 2 weeks when I found those 3 entries. I had seen by then the full sweep of what the family had built and how they had eventually failed it. The people in the kitchen were more complicated than the kitchen moment, as people always are. That did not change what the kitchen moment meant, but it made the finding feel different than I had imagined it might feel. Not smaller, different, more complete. The way a truth that arrives after long waiting tends to feel, not like a revelation, but like a confirmation of something you had carried so long you had forgotten it was separate from you. I found the entries on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, about 2 hours before I would have normally packed up for the day. The staff member assigned to supervise my review was a young woman named Morgan, who had been reading something on her phone with commendable discretion. Throughout most of our sessions, when I found the entries, I asked her to confirm the account structure, which she did, which told me the records were authentic organizational documents and not informal notations. Then I thanked her and said I was finishing early today. She looked slightly surprised. I had not previously left early, and then went back to her phone. I drove home, not to the office, home. I made dinner, which I do not typically do on weekdays during an active case. Usually I eat whatever is fastest and available. I cooked something. I sat at the kitchen table and ate it, and looked at the wall, and let the finding be present with me in the same domestic space, where my mother had once put her hands flat on a table and looked at them. I thought about the 3 entries. I thought about the watches. I thought about Mr. Carter's envelope, and the 2 weeks of cash and the back gate and the bike. I thought about Jason Walker telling me I had been flagged as a higher-risk candidate. I thought about Haley, who had stopped turning around. I thought about the girl in the hallway who had looked through me like I wasn't there. I thought about the guidance counselor's "let's be realistic" delivered to a student whose realism had never been the problem. I thought about my mother's hands. I let all of it be present, the entire accumulated weight of it, sitting there in the kitchen on a Tuesday night with a finding in my briefcase that had been true for 23 years and was only now existing in the record. Then I washed the dish, made coffee, sat at the window for a while, went to bed. In the morning I went back to work. The following week I found the insurance documentation confirming the watch transfer to off-site storage. This was more work. It required cross-referencing the company's general ledger against a separate insurance file that was stored in a different section of the archive, a connection that would only appear to someone who was looking across the full scope of the records with the specific awareness that both files might be relevant. I was that person. The watch transfer record was less emotionally loaded than the cash entries had been. By the time I found it, I had already absorbed the larger finding. This was confirming detail, important professionally, completing the picture, but not the pivot point. The pivot point had already happened. What the watch record confirmed was the most specific, most actionable part of what I suspected. Not merely that the family had internal financial problems and had moved cash to manage them, but that the reported theft had been a constructed narrative, not an accident, not a misidentification, but a deliberate and specific act designed to explain away something they needed explained. The choice of me as the explanation was not impulsive. It was the choice of people who looked around the available options and determined that the person with the least power, the least standing, and the least ability to push back was the cleanest solution. I've thought about this a lot, about the specific quality of that choice, the calculation in it. You don't have to be malicious to make that calculation. You have to be desperate, and you have to have grown up in a world where certain people's costs simply don't register the way your own do. Tyler and Madison Harrington were not, I think, unusual in their moral architecture. They were average people under pressure, who made the choice that average people under pressure make when the system around them has spent their entire lives telling them that the cost of their choices falls on a category of person whose costs don't count. What made them unusual was that the category of person they chose happened to spend the next 23 years learning the specific skill set that would eventually sit at the center of their financial reckoning. That part was luck, or something like luck, the kind of probabilistic outcome that can only look inevitable in retrospect. I do not believe the universe arranged itself to produce justice in this particular case. I believe a lot of restructuring cases go to a lot of consultants, and most of them do not involve the personal history I brought to this one, and the outcome is simply whatever the numbers produce. In this case, the numbers produce this. If a different consultant had been assigned, the records would still have been true. The outcome would probably have been similar. The restructuring logic was the restructuring logic regardless of who ran it, and the moment of recognition across the conference table simply would not have occurred. The recognition across the conference table was not the point. I want to say that clearly because it would be easy, in this kind of telling, to let the dramatic personal moment become the climax in a way that overstates its importance. The point was the job done correctly. The point was the truth, in the record. The moment of recognition was a consequence of doing the job correctly, and it was significant, but it was not the purpose. The purpose was the work. It always was. Here is what I want you to hear, if you are listening to this story from a place of something done to you that deserved to be undone. The work is the purpose, not because the work produces justice. It doesn't, always, or even usually, but because the work is the thing you control. You cannot control whether the universe arranges an occasion for the record to be corrected. You cannot control whether the people who hurt you face consequences proportional to what they did. You can control whether you become, through sustained effort and complete integrity, someone whose work is so thorough and so honest that when the occasion arises, if it arises, you are the person in the room who knows what is true and can prove it. That is a different aspiration than revenge. It is also, I have found, more reliable. And here is the cost, stated one more time because I think it needs to be stated plainly enough that it cannot be missed. To become that person, I became the person I became, which is a person who is good at the work and careful with the truth and genuinely proud of what he has built, and who is also enclosed in a specific way, and who wakes sometimes at 3 a.m. in a very quiet apartment, and who let someone genuinely good walk out of his life because he couldn't find his way out of the architecture that had kept him moving for 20 years. That is the price, listed clearly, not as a deterrent, as an accounting. If you would have made different choices, if you would have found a way to do the work without letting it cost you the same things, I want to know. Tell me in the comments, not because I think you're wrong, because I genuinely do not know whether the choices that produced this outcome were the only choices that could have produced it, or whether there was another path through this that I couldn't see, that someone else might have found. The question I am still living is whether the cost and the outcome were structurally linked, whether you cannot have this specific kind of victory without this specific kind of price, or whether the link was my own construction, my own limitation, my own failure to find a way through that preserved more of what I gave up. I don't know the answer. I'm not sure I ever will. But the work is real. The truth is in the record. My mother calls on Sundays. That's where I am. The 4 weeks inside the Harrington offices were unlike any investigation I had conducted before, and not because of the personal dimension, though that was present and I will address it. They were unlike other investigations because the combination of factors, the scale of the historical records, the specific character of the company's decline, and the way the truth was distributed across 2 decades of documents, produced a case that rewarded depth more than most. The offices themselves occupied the 17th floor, as I mentioned. The current space was leased. They had sold the building 2 years prior as part of an earlier attempt at liquidity management that had not resolved the underlying problem. The office was professional and deliberate and slightly too large for the current headcount, a residual of a prior footprint that the company had not fully contracted from. Empty desks that no one had moved. A conference room that sat 12 with 8 chairs arranged around the table. Derek Cooper met me on my first morning at 8, sharp 15 minutes before I was expected, which I registered as a signal about his state of mind. He was a careful man in his late 40s, who wore the specific look of someone who has been managing a deteriorating situation for longer than he anticipated when he took the job. He had joined Harrington Holdings 7 years before, recruited from a larger commercial real estate firm where he had had a strong reputation, and the situation he had inherited had been worse than the due diligence showed, a fact he acknowledged without complaint in our first working conversation, which I found immediately creditable. He walked me through the current financial structure in an hour, which was impressively concise, given the complexity. He had a command of the debt instruments that suggested he had been living with them for months, turning them over in his mind the way you turn over something you cannot resolve. When I asked questions that went beyond the current structure, questions about historical decisions, about the original underwriting on the Westfield development, about the transition of management after the father's death, his answers were honest, and where he didn't know things, he said so directly. By the end of the first day, I had established 3 working hypotheses about the structure of the problem and organized my investigation plan around testing them. The hypotheses were, first, that the core decline had originated in a concentration of risk in the commercial real estate portfolio that had been identifiable, at the time the decisions were made, as above the appropriate threshold. Second, that the management transition after the father's death had accelerated the exposure by reducing the operational discipline on a portfolio that required close monitoring. And third, that there was a historical financial management pattern that had contributed to the current creditors' skepticism in ways that were not fully visible in the current disclosures. The third hypothesis was the one that would eventually produce the finding I've described. But I didn't know that in the first week. I was working the hypothesis as a hypothesis, something to test, not something to confirm. The second week I went into the historical records. This is where the work became less like analysis and more like archaeology. The Harrington Company had been running for 38 years, and the records of those 38 years occupied the 3 archive rooms on the lower level, physical files, bankers' boxes, organized by year and then by category, tax filings, bank statements, internal ledgers, correspondence. The earlier years had been on paper before the company converted to digital record-keeping in the mid-90s, and the paper records were well maintained in a way that suggested the administrative staff of the earlier era had taken documentation seriously. I worked through the archive methodically. The staff member assigned to supervise, Morgan, I'll use only her first name since she played no role in the substance of the case, was discreet and professional, and entirely uninterested in the content of what I was reviewing, which suited me. I had long experience working in archives alongside people who were performing the function of presence while detached from its contents, and I found the arrangement conducive to the deep reading that archive work requires. The early years of the company were interesting in a way I had not anticipated. The father, Scott Harrington, had been a genuinely capable operator in the formative years. The first decade of financial records showed careful management, conservative leverage, incremental growth. The company had built its initial portfolio through disciplined acquisitions at a time when the regional commercial real estate market offered real opportunities to operators who were patient and selective. Scott Harrington, in those years, had been patient and selective. The early records were the records of a man who understood risk. Then, in the late period of his leadership, something had shifted. The acquisitions got larger and more aggressive. The leverage ratios climbed past the conservative thresholds the earlier years had maintained. The Westfield development, the one he had mentioned to Tyler and Madison in the study, the one I had overheard from the corridor, was the first of a series of projects that reflected a different decision-making posture. Not reckless exactly, more like a gambler who has played carefully for years and decides, at some inflection point, that the conservative game has cost him the bigger wins he believes he deserves. I've seen this pattern many times since. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the companies I have worked with. A period of disciplined success followed by a shift in appetite that looks, from the inside, like deserved confidence and looks, from the outside, like the beginning of a decline. The internal story and the external reality diverge, and the divergence is invisible to the person living inside the story because the success that preceded the shift feels like evidence that the shift is warranted. Scott Harrington had made the shift in his late 50s, which is actually a common inflection point. It is the age at which people who have built something real look at what they have built and ask whether the building was the full expression of what they were capable of, or merely the preliminary. The answer to that question, in financial terms, is almost always that the building was the full expression. The attempt to go further is almost always where the damage begins. The specific records from the period when I had worked at the house, the December of my 16th year, were in year 23 of the company's history. I reached them midway through the second week. I was not looking for them specifically. I was looking for the pattern of cash management decisions that would tell me how the company had navigated its liquidity constraints in the period leading up to the current default. The 3 entries appeared on a Tuesday afternoon. I have described finding them, and the quality of that discovery, in enough detail already. What I want to add is the professional dimension of the finding, what it meant in terms of the case, independently of what it meant to me. In a restructuring context, historical cash management anomalies matter for 2 reasons. The first is technical. They affect the analysis of the company's liquidity history, and therefore the creditor's assessment of the management team's reliability. A company that has a history of internal cash movements that were not properly documented or disclosed is a company where the creditors have a legitimate basis for requiring additional safeguards in any restructuring agreement. This is not punitive, it is risk-adjusted. The second reason is legal. In any proceeding involving creditor claims, the documentation of historical financial management practices is available to creditors' counsel. And if those practices involve misrepresentation, even historical misrepresentation, even misrepresentation that has nothing directly to do with the current debt instruments, counsel for the creditors can introduce that documentation as evidence of a pattern of management behavior. This can affect the terms of the restructuring agreement, the covenants imposed on the surviving entity, and the creditor's willingness to accept a negotiated resolution rather than pushing for liquidation. I knew all of this when I sat in the archive room on Tuesday afternoon. I knew that the 3 entries were not merely personal history. They were professionally relevant documents that had a direct bearing on the legitimate interests of the people I was representing. The fact that they also happened to be 23-year-old confirmation of the worst thing that had ever happened to me was real, and I was not going to pretend it wasn't. But it did not change the professional analysis. It only made the professional analysis personally significant. When I brought Derek Cooper into the archive room the following day and asked him to walk me through the administrative ledger conventions from that period, I watched his face carefully. He confirmed the account structure without any sign of recognizing the significance of the specific entries I was looking at. He was explaining accounting conventions. He had no reason to be looking at the pattern the entries formed over those 3 weeks in December. When he finished and I thanked him, and he went back upstairs to his office, I sat for another hour with the documents, not reviewing them. I had reviewed them thoroughly, sitting with them, letting them exist. These were real documents, real records, proof of a real thing that had been denied for 23 years. Not denied loudly. It had never been contested, because I had never been able to contest it. It had simply been stated and accepted and left on the record of a 16-year-old's reputation without any mechanism for correction, until now. The mechanism was impersonal and procedural and completely indifferent to the personal dimension. It was the mechanism of due diligence in a legitimate financial process, operating with the normal efficiency of a system that requires thoroughness. The mechanism didn't know or care about the corridor, or the borrowed toolbox, or the envelope of cash. It only knew that a document existed, that it was material to the analysis, and that it would therefore be included in the record. That impersonality was, I found, more satisfying than any version of personal confrontation would have been, because it meant the truth was not being entered into the record by my hand, driven by my feeling, potentially questioned for my motive. It was being entered into the record by the professional process that exists precisely to ensure that material facts are included in the analysis, regardless of whether they are convenient. The truth was doing its own work. I was simply the person thorough enough to find it. The third and fourth weeks of the investigation were focused on building the restructuring framework, the actual deliverable that the case required. I have described this in broad terms. The detail of it was a kind of parallel track running alongside the personal dimension, and the parallel track was where I spent most of my conscious attention, because it was the track that required active decision-making, and because it was the track on which the quality of my professional judgment would be evaluated. The framework I developed went through 3 complete drafts before I was satisfied with it. The first draft was technically sound, but over-conservative in its treatment of the surviving operational entity. It produced a structure that would have satisfied the creditor's short-term position, but left the entity with insufficient operating capital to sustain the revenue needed to service the restructured obligations. The second draft corrected this, but created a subordination structure that the junior creditor group would not accept. The third draft found the specific equilibrium between those competing constraints. Each draft required a full day of financial modeling, a review of the legal frameworks applicable to the instruments involved, and a qualitative assessment of each creditor group's actual versus stated position, their true minimum acceptable outcome rather than the maximum they were claiming. This qualitative assessment was the part that separated adequate restructuring practitioners from good ones. Most people in the field could build the financial model. Fewer could read the room accurately enough to know which stated position was the actual floor and which was the opening bid. I had spent 10 years watching people in rooms decide what they were actually willing to accept. I had a reliable calibration for the difference. The night before the final meeting, I went back to the office. This was not unusual for me before a major case presentation. I typically returned to the office after dinner on the evening before a final meeting and went through the materials one last time, not to add anything, but to ensure that everything I was going to present was as tightly organized and as directly supported as it could be. The quality of a presentation is not separable from the quality of the preparation. But this time, sitting at the conference table in the empty room with the materials in front of me, I paused. I thought about what I was doing, not the professional task. I had thought about that exhaustively, the personal reality of what I was about to do. I was going to walk into a room with Tyler and Madison Harrington and present documents that established the truth of what had happened in their kitchen 23 years ago. I was going to do it professionally, within the context of a legitimate financial process, with a recommendation that was technically sound and professionally defensible by any standard, and then I was going to watch their faces. I had not allowed myself to think about watching their faces. I had been deliberately, specifically not thinking about it. I was thinking about it now because the avoidance was its own form of dishonesty, and I had too much respect for honesty to maintain the avoidance indefinitely. What did I want from that moment? I sat with the question until I had an honest answer. I did not want an apology. I had understood for years that an apology from Tyler or Madison Harrington would produce nothing of value. Not closure, not repair, not the return of anything taken. An apology is a transaction between people who have a relationship, and we had no relationship. We had a history, and we had a case, and we had a professional proceeding. I did not want visible suffering. That is the fantasy of grievance, and I had worked through enough of the fantasy version over the years to know it was a fantasy. Real suffering in real people is not satisfying to witness. It is only disturbing, and then sad, and then a reminder that you are watching a person, not a target. What I wanted was something simpler and harder to name. I wanted them to know, not as a performance, not as a confrontation, as a fact. I wanted to be in the room when the fact landed, when the distance between what had been declared true in that kitchen and what was actually true finally collapsed. I wanted to be present when the record was corrected, not for the satisfaction of it, but for the completeness of it. The way you want to be in a place when something that has been unresolved for a long time is finally resolved, not to celebrate, but to witness. That was what I wanted, witness. I organized my materials and went home and slept 4 hours, which was more than I expected. Between the first meeting and the final one, there were 9 case progress meetings. I want to tell you about 3 of them, because they show something about what it was actually like to spend 4 weeks in professional proximity to people who had marked you permanently at 16, with neither party acknowledging the mark. The third meeting was the first one where Tyler said something that wasn't a question about the case. He said it at the end of the session, when the formal agenda had been covered and the creditor attorney was packing up. And he said it quietly, not quite to me and not quite to the room, more in the way that people make observations when they are testing whether an observation is welcome. He said, "You didn't come from this kind of work from the beginning, did you?" I looked at him. He said, "Most of the practitioners I've met in this field came up through the investment banking track. You have a different quality, more patient, less transactional." I said, "I came up through credit analysis. It's a different discipline." He said, "Well, what drew you to it?" I said, "I found I had an aptitude for understanding how debt structures actually behave under stress, what the numbers mean when the conditions change." He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are processing something that is only partially about the answer they've received. He picked up his portfolio and said, "See you Thursday," and left. I sat in the empty room for a moment. He had not recognized me. He was 40 years old and I was 40, and my face had changed as all faces change over 2 decades. The structure was the same, but everything else was different. The softness of adolescence long gone, replaced by the particular settled quality that comes from years of deliberate occupation. My voice was different. My bearing was different. The person he had seen at 16 had been trying very hard not to be seen. The person across the table from him now occupied rooms without effort. But I thought about his question, what drew you to it? And I thought about what it would have meant to answer it honestly. To say, what drew me to understanding how debt behaves under stress was watching a family use their financial problems as a justification for destroying a teenager's reputation, and the understanding that arrived in that corridor, that whoever holds the language of money holds a form of power. I was going to spend my life learning to hold correctly. I thought about saying that, and I thought about his face, if I had, and then I picked up my briefcase and left. The 6th meeting was harder, not because of anything that was said. Nothing was said that was notable. It was hard because of Madison. She had been largely silent in the meetings. She attended, she listened, she occasionally asked questions that were technically informed. She was not unintelligent, which I had known at 16 and which had not changed. But she contributed less to the working sessions than Tyler did, and her general posture was one of controlled withdrawal. She was in the room, but she was not fully in the room. In the 6th meeting, during a discussion of the collateral analysis for the primary facility, she said something directed at me for the first time in any of the sessions. She said, The property you're referencing as collateral, is there an alternative treatment that would allow it to remain within the estate? Her voice was controlled and professional and entirely flat. She meant the mansion. I said, within the constraints of the primary facility terms, there is no treatment that satisfies the creditors while retaining that asset. The collateral designation is contractual. She said, what if the asset value were sufficient to satisfy the facility on its own? I said, current valuation places it at approximately 40% of the facility principal. That is insufficient. She looked at the table. I said, the current valuation reflects market conditions for distressed sales. A patient sale in a different circumstance could produce a higher return, but the terms of the facility don't allow for a patient sale timeline. She said nothing more about it. But I noticed her expression in that moment, and it was the first moment in all the weeks of the case where the professional exterior was not fully continuous. For just a moment, there was something else. Not grief exactly, more like a specific, reluctant recognition, the face of someone who was coming to terms with a loss they had been avoiding defining. The mansion was her childhood home. It was my old workplace. These were not equivalent facts, but they were both real. I left the meeting and drove back to the office and worked on the modeling for another 3 hours. I did not think about Madison's expression while I was working. I thought about it later, at home, and I did not find it satisfying. I found it human, which is different and more complicated. The 8th meeting, 2 days before the final one, was just Tyler and me and Derek Cooper. The other parties had sent their proxies. It was the last working session before the recommendation was formally presented, and its purpose was to review the financial summary so that Tyler could say, at the final meeting, that he had seen the numbers and understood them. Derek walked through the summary with the quiet efficiency he brought to all his work. Tyler asked questions. The questions were good questions, specific, technically informed, and they told me something about who he had become as a professional. He had spent 20 years running a real business, imperfectly and ultimately unsuccessfully, but with genuine effort and real engagement. He was not the performance of competence. He was a person who had learned something the hard way, and was now watching that learning be insufficient. At the end of the meeting, after Derek had left the room to take a call, Tyler and I sat across the table from each other in silence for a moment. Not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who have run out of meeting agenda and haven't yet decided to leave. He said, "What's your read on how the creditor group is going to receive the recommendation?" I said, "They'll accept it. The primary lender will want 2 additional covenants on the surviving entity, but those are negotiable on language if not on substance. The junior tranche will be harder. They're looking at a significant haircut, and they're going to want some form of management oversight requirement. That can be structured," he said, "and they'll get the building." I said, "The primary creditors will receive the primary collateral. That's the terms of the instruments." He looked out the window at the city. It was late afternoon, and the light was good. The low October light that makes every city look like a version of itself that is slightly better than the reality. He said, "I grew up in that building." I said, "I know." He turned and looked at me. Something in the specific inflection of those 2 words, not sympathetic, not cold, just precise, registered with him. He looked at me with a quality of attention that was different from anything in the preceding weeks. Not recognition, the precursor to the recognition, the sense that something is slightly wrong in the expected pattern of a person, a small wrongness you can't place. He looked at me for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Thursday at 2, and picked up his portfolio. I said, "Thursday at 2. He left. I sat in the room for a minute. The light was still good. The city was still there. I thought, one more day. The aftermath of the case took longer to settle than I expected. Not the legal and financial machinery, which operated with the implacable efficiency of a well-designed process, but the internal settling. The thing that happens after a significant event when the event is finished, and the adrenaline and the preparation and the sustained intensity have nowhere left to go. I have read about this in the literature of high-performance work. Athletes describe it, surgeons describe it. Anyone who operates at extreme intensity for extended periods describes the specific flatness that follows. The sustained demand has calibrated your system to a certain level of activation, and when the demand drops, the system doesn't immediately recalibrate. You exist for a period at a level of internal activation for which there is no current external demand. For me, that period lasted about 3 months. I continued working. Apex had other cases, the work went on, but I carried a specific quality of stillness that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. I was processing something that didn't have a direct name. I was processing the distance between what I had imagined over years and what had actually happened. The imagined version, in whatever forms it had taken, and it had taken many over the years, in the unguarded moments before sleep, when the mind goes where it wants, had always been more dramatic, more declaratory, more about my voice, my words, a confrontation that produced something visible and cathartic and sufficient. Real life had been quieter and more institutional and more complete. Real life had been documents and creditor meetings and a final sentence that had landed without theater. I found, during those 3 months, that the quiet version was better. Not because it was less dramatic, but because it was more true. The dramatic version would have been about me, my grievance, my vindication, my voice. The quiet version was about the facts. The facts did what facts do when they are properly documented and placed in the correct context. They produced their natural consequences without needing anyone to perform them. I had spent 23 years carrying a story. At the final meeting, the story had been replaced by a record. That replacement is the cleanest possible outcome. It does not require the other party to acknowledge anything, to apologize for anything, to feel anything. It simply requires the facts to exist where they can be found. They exist. They will continue to exist. In the files of that restructuring case, in the records of the proceedings, in the documentation that will survive, long after everyone who was in that conference room has gone. That is not nothing. That is, I have come to understand almost everything that was actually available, and in the space that the carrying had occupied, something is slowly, incrementally growing. Not peace exactly. I have become suspicious of the word peace as a description of anything except the absence of active suffering, something more like available space, room for things that the long discipline of the wound had displaced. The Sunday calls feel longer recently. I have been cooking dinner on weekdays more often. Small things, the size of things that fit in the space that wasn't there before. I watched the sunrise from my window last week, which I am rarely awake early enough to do, and I sat with it for about 20 minutes without doing anything else, and I thought, the work is real, the truth is in the record, and then I thought, what else? I don't have the answer yet. But I have, for the first time in a long time, the genuine sense that I am asking the question, rather than running past it. That might be the most honest thing I have said in this entire telling. Put it in the comments, any of it. What you would have done in that kitchen at 16. Whether you would have taken the case when the file landed on your desk. Whether you would have included the documents that confirmed what the family had done, if you'd been the one to find them. Whether you would have said more at the final meeting or less, or walked out differently. I am genuinely asking, not for validation. I have stopped needing that from outside myself. But because the questions this story raises are not only mine, they belong to anyone who has been in a room where the truth was ignored in favor of someone else's convenience, and had to decide what to do about it with the tools available, over the time available, at the cost available. The questions belong to all of us. The answers, as usual, are still being worked out. The first meeting with the Harrington principals was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9 o'clock at their corporate offices downtown. They still had corporate offices on the 17th floor of a building they had partially owned until 2 years before, when they'd had to sell the building and convert to lease space, a detail that was in the file and that I found quietly illustrative of how the decline had progressed. I arrived 12 minutes early. I sat in the lobby and went through the materials I had spent the prior week absorbing, not reviewing them for the first time, but running through them the way a musician runs scales, making sure the information was available at the surface level of my attention rather than buried in the notes. The debt structure was complex. $280 million in total exposure across 7 separate instruments, a primary revolving credit facility, 2 term loans, a mezzanine tranche from a private equity firm, and 3 smaller, project-specific loans tied to specific developments that had gone badly. The interest accumulations on the mezzanine tranche alone were generating more cash drain per month than the company's operating revenue could cover. They had been in technical default on 2 of the instruments for 6 months. From a purely technical standpoint, it was a legitimate restructuring case, not the most complex I had handled, but not simple either. A combination of over-leveraged acquisitions made during a period of relative market optimism, followed by market conditions that made the underlying assumptions worthless, combined with what appeared, from the financials, to be some genuinely poor operational decisions in the preceding 4 years. The kind of decline that always looks avoidable in retrospect and feels inevitable from the inside. A woman came to get me from reception and led me through a hallway that was trying very hard to communicate stability, good furniture, framed company history on the walls, the visual language of an organization that was still solid. I had seen this staging before, in other companies I had worked with. It was the look of an entity performing competence for the benefit of its own employees, because the alternative was a visible deterioration of morale that would accelerate the decline. The conference room was large, with a view of the city. There were 5 people at the table. A corporate attorney named Kevin Brooks. I recognized him from his firm's reputation, solid, serious work. 2 financial advisors I had encountered peripherally in previous cases, both competent. A CFO, a man named Derek Cooper, who had the specific expression of someone who has been managing a crisis for longer than his stamina was designed to sustain. And Tyler Harrington and Madison Harrington Pierce. I walked in and set my briefcase on the table and looked at both of them. Tyler was 40 years old. The easy physical confidence of high school had settled into something slightly less easy, still present but sitting on top of something that wasn't there at 17. A particular quality of strain around the eyes, a deliberateness in his expression that suggested he was managing his presentation carefully. He was still handsome in the specific way that certain men who peaked early remain handsome, structurally, as a fact of genetics, without the animation that makes handsomeness actually compelling. Madison was 39. The bored precision I remembered had not left her, but it had been refined into something more professional. She was dressed carefully, expensively, and her posture was the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where her family name carried weight and was now having to work out what that name was worth in a room where it carried none. Neither of them looked at me with any recognition. I was a professional consultant. They had not met before. An expert their bank had insisted they work with, a person in a good suit with an established reputation, arriving to help manage a problem they had created. I sat down. "Thank you for having me," as I said. "I've spent the last week with the initial disclosure package. Before we go through the specifics, I want to establish a few things about how I work." I looked at Tyler, then at Madison, then at Derek Cooper. "I will need full documentary access to all financial records, including historical records going back at least 15 years. I will need direct access to your key internal staff without the review of this legal team, and I will need your assurance that there will be no withholding of relevant information, even information you consider damaging. My ability to build a framework that works depends entirely on knowing what is actually true, not the narrative you have been managing, the actual truth." There was a brief pause. Kevin Brooks started to say something about standard protocols and scope limitations. I let him finish, and then I said, "Those are my terms. If they're not acceptable, I'll leave now, and you can find someone else. I understand the bank made this referral conditionally. The condition was me." Another pause. Tyler said, "That's fine." His voice was the same, slightly deeper with age, but the same fundamental quality, the voice of someone accustomed to decisions landing where he intended. He said it as if it were simple, as if he were granting access rather than agreeing to a term. Old reflex. I said, "Good, let's start." Over the next 3 weeks, I worked inside their records the way I always worked, methodically, comprehensively, without shortcutting anything. Derek Cooper was cooperative in a way that suggested he was relieved to have someone actually capable of understanding what he had been looking at for 2 years. He was a competent CFO who had been handed an inherited mess and had been managing it, with decreasing resources and increasing desperation. He gave me access to everything. The first week I spent in the current debt structure, tracing each instrument to its origin point, understanding the decisions that had created each layer of the problem. The second week I went further back, the 5-year history, then the 10-year history. By the end of the second week I was in the archives, pulling records from the early operations of the company. It was in the third week, going through historical cash records from approximately 23 years before, that I found it. I was not looking for it. I want to be clear about that too, because in retrospect the finding feels inevitable, almost scripted, but at the time it was genuinely accidental. I was tracing a pattern of internal transfer activity to understand the company's historical liquidity management, a normal part of deep due diligence on a restructuring case. The transfers I was looking at were from the period when the company was already, as I knew from the documents, experiencing significant cash pressure. Looking for the internal transfer patterns from that period was routine, and there, in a sequence of entries from a period that corresponded exactly to December of the year I had worked at the house, was a series of internal cash movements. 3 entries, 2 weeks apart, then a third. The amounts were specific. They corresponded in total to the amount I had been told was stolen from the study, a figure I had never forgotten because I had spent years carrying the label attached to it. The movements were marked as petty cash reallocation, administrative in the internal ledger. They moved through an account that was, according to the records, designated for the children's personal allowance management, an arrangement, apparently, that the father had set up to give them some operational autonomy. The watches were separate. There was a separate insurance record. I found it in the 4th week, while cross-referencing asset values, that listed the watches as transferred to private collection storage approximately 2 months after the reported theft. Not stolen, transferred. The claim, I found by pulling further, had never actually been filed with the insurance company. They had been reported internally as missing, but no claim had been filed, because they hadn't actually been stolen. I sat at the conference table in the records room for approximately 4 minutes after I found the watch transfer record. Derek Cooper was in the room with me, working on something else, and he looked over once and I said nothing and he went back to his work. I understood then, with a completeness and a clarity that was almost architectural, the way you understand something when every piece finally fits. Exactly what had happened 23 years ago. They had needed money to cover the internal transfers. They had needed to explain the movement of cash in a way that didn't point to them. They had needed, most specifically, to create a distraction from the financial situation their father had described in the study, the situation I had overheard, the situation they knew I'd overheard. The watches had been a prop. The cash had been moved by them, not stolen. And I had been the explanation. 16 years old, borrowed toolbox, $12 an hour. I breathed in once, slowly, and then I went back to work. The following week, I finalized the restructuring framework. I worked through 3 possible structures before settling on the one that was technically correct, not the one that would be most comfortable for the Harrington principles, not the one that minimized their loss, but the one that satisfied the creditor's legitimate claims while maintaining enough operational continuity to make the process orderly. This was my job. I did my job. But within the framework, I also documented, fully and with complete evidence, the historical, financial records including the internal transfer sequence. This was also my job. In a restructuring historical cash management patterns are directly relevant to the assessment of the entity's reliability and the creditor's risk calculus. The documentation was not optional, it was professionally mandatory. The final meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon. The full principal group, plus the bank representatives, plus the lead counsel for the primary creditor group. 9 people in the room, plus me. Tyler and Madison arrived together, which they always did, a habit I had noticed across all our meetings, a sibling solidarity that I understood was partly genuine, and partly a defensive reflex developed over years of navigating a business that had been declining around them. I set up my materials at the head of the table. Derek Cooper sat to my right, a small professional recognition of how much of this process he had supported. The attorneys arranged themselves. Tyler and Madison sat on the opposite side of the table midway down, with their counsel beside them. I started the presentation with the structure itself, the framework, the recommended approach, the creditor satisfaction model. I went through it with the precision and the detail it required, because it was good work and it deserved to be presented as such. The creditor counsel asked 3 questions. I answered all 3. Kevin Brooks asked 2 more. I answered those. Then I said, before I finalize the recommendation, there's a historical records finding that I need to present, because it directly affects the creditor's risk assessment and the appropriate terms of the restructuring agreement. Tyler shifted in his seat. It was small, barely perceptible, but I had been watching him for 4 weeks across a series of meetings, and I knew his physical vocabulary at this point, the way you know the body language of someone you have been studying, and that shift was something. I presented the transfer records. I walked through them slowly, each entry, the amounts, the dates, the account designations. I cross-referenced them with the insurance records on the watches. I laid out the timeline. I did not editorialize. I did not say what the pattern meant. I let the documents speak. The room was very quiet. Tyler's attorney started to say something. Tyler stopped him with one hand. I continued. The records indicate that the cash movements from this account, designated as the personal account, managed jointly by both principals during the period in question, correspond precisely to the amount reported internally as stolen from the study. No police report was filed. No insurance claim was made. The watches were transferred to off-site storage, not reported as stolen to any insurer, 2 months after the reported loss. I paused. The conclusion available from these records is that no theft occurred. The assets were moved internally. Madison was looking at the table. I waited a moment. Then I said, this affects the restructuring in 2 specific ways. First, it establishes a historical pattern of internal cash management that is inconsistent with the representations made to creditors during the period when the company was seeking additional capital. The lenders will need to factor this into the covenants on any restructured agreement. Second, and this is the recommendation I'm formalizing today, given the established pattern of management decisions and the severity of the current exposure, the appropriate restructuring pathway is full asset transfer to creditors on the primary secured instruments, including the residential property held as collateral, with survival of the operational entity in a reduced form sufficient to manage the remaining obligations. The residential property held as collateral was the mansion, the one with the fountain in the driveway. Kevin Brooks started walking through the legal implications with the creditor counsel. Derek Cooper was taking notes. The bank representatives were speaking quietly between themselves. The machinery of the process was moving, because that is what the machinery does when the recommendation is sound. It moves. Tyler was looking at me. For the first time in the 4 weeks we had been working together, he was actually looking at me. Not at a professional, not at a consultant. At me, the specific person across the table. I watched the recognition working its way forward through 23 years of distance. The slow assembly of something he had not thought about in years, or maybe had thought about privately, in the way we sometimes carry the things we've done without wanting to name them directly. I watched him get there. It took approximately 30 seconds. When he arrived, his expression didn't collapse. That's the thing I remember most clearly. It didn't produce a dramatic moment of shock. It produced something quieter, a particular stillness, a going inward, the face of someone who has just had a very large thing confirmed rather than revealed. Madison was still looking at the table. The meeting continued. The framework was accepted. The terms were agreed to in principle, pending final legal documentation. The process that would transfer the mansion and the primary business holdings to the creditor group was set in motion. They would be left with the operational shell of the company, reduced, stripped of its primary assets, sufficient to service the remaining obligations over time. Not nothing, but not what they had grown up believing was permanent. As the meeting ended and people began collecting papers and moving toward the door, I packed my briefcase. I was doing it methodically, the way I always do, not rushing. The room was clearing. Tyler had not moved. When it was just the two of us, Madison had gone through the door without looking back. I clicked my briefcase closed and looked at him. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Which part?" He absorbed that. I said, "I knew who you were in the first meeting. I've known what those transfer records meant since the third week. And you were already—" He stopped. "Your bank called me," I said. "I took the case. My job was to do the job. I did the job." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What happened back then?" He stopped again. He was looking for a frame for it, I think. A way to make it into something that could be explained, or apologized for, or minimized with a word. I said, "Back then, you needed someone to blame." He looked at me. I paused. "Now you'll have to live with the truth." I picked up my briefcase and walked out. I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it's the part of this story that I've had the hardest time being honest about. I had imagined over the years, not obsessively, not constantly, but in the specific way that unresolved things surface when you're too tired to keep them contained, that there would be a release in that moment, that something would close, that I would walk out of that room and feel a version of the thing that people describe as vindication or resolution or peace. I felt nothing like that. I felt tired. I felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something for so long that the release of it doesn't produce relief, but rather the discovery of how heavy it was. I walked through the lobby of the building and out the front doors and stood on the sidewalk in the October air and thought about Paige Turner telling me I was the most unreachable person she had ever been close to. I thought about my mother's hands, flat on the kitchen table, all those years ago. I thought about the version of me that had biked 4 miles to a back gate with a borrowed toolbox and waited 15 minutes outside because he was early and didn't want to seem presumptuous. That kid had deserved better. He had deserved a world where the thing that happened to him didn't happen, and no amount of professional precision, no documented financial finding, no transfer of a mansion to a creditor group was going to retroactively give that to him. You can build a life. You can earn real things. You can stand across a table from the people who marked you and make them live with the truth. But the years that were taken from you are still taken. The weight that was put on you at 16 is still the weight that shaped the way you move. You carry it in your back, in your sleep patterns, in the specific quality of distance you maintain from everyone who might get close. That is the price. That is what none of the professional narrative prepares you for. I know what I am now. I am a person who built something real from a ruined starting point. I am someone who walked back into a room that should have broken him and was the most competent person at the table. I am someone who found the truth and documented it and let it speak for itself. I am also someone who still wakes up at 3 in the morning sometimes and sits in the dark of a very quiet apartment and thinks about a 16-year-old boy standing at a back gate in a borrowed jacket, waiting to be seen. The case closed 6 months after that final meeting. The mansion transferred to the creditor group in a transaction that was reported briefly in the regional business press, a notable asset, a family name that had carried weight in the city. Tyler and Madison retained operational control of the reduced entity and spent the following 2 years, from what I can tell through professional channels, managing the unwinding of the remaining obligations. It was not a dramatic public collapse. It was the slow, grinding administrative process of a business that had run out of runway. Worse, in some ways, than a clean failure. Mr. Carter, the estate manager for my old Saturday shifts, had retired years before. I thought about him occasionally. He had been decent to me, in the specific way that some people are decent to others when no one is watching. Not heroic, just decent. I hope he had a good retirement. Derek Cooper, the CFO, found a new position within 3 months. He was good at his job, and the industry knew it. I wrote him a professional reference that I meant sincerely. He deserved it. Madison reached out through a mutual professional contact approximately 8 months after the case closed. I was told she was seeking a conversation. I told the contact that I didn't have time in my calendar. This was not entirely true. It was true enough. Tyler did not reach out. I don't know what that means. I've considered various possibilities. That he was too proud. That he understood, on some level, that there was nothing to be said. That he had filed the encounter in a place he preferred not to open. Any of those things could be true. I find I don't need to know. My mother retired 3 years before the Harrington case. I had been helping her financially for almost a decade by then. Not dramatically, not with any kind of announcement, just making sure that her situation was stable in the ways it had not been when I was young. When she retired, she moved to a smaller city in a warmer state, somewhere flat and quiet, and she called me every Sunday and we talked about the weather and small things and occasionally about the old apartment, the old neighborhood, the years that were hard. She never asked me directly about the Harrington case. I think she had understood, in the way she always understood things without requiring them to be named, that something had closed. There is one more thing I want to say, and I've been working out how to say it through most of this telling. I achieved what I set out to achieve, not the way I planned it when I was 16, not through any of the specific fantasies that a 16-year-old builds from injustice. The real version was slower and more complicated and less satisfying than the imagined version, the way real things always are. But the outcome was real. The truth was documented. The consequences were administered by the legitimate machinery of the financial system, not by my hand, not by my anger, but by the simple, irresistible operation of what is true and what is provable. And yet, if I could speak to the 16-year-old version of myself, the one on the bike, the borrowed toolbox, the worn boots, I don't think I would tell him any of this. I don't think I would describe the case or the final meeting or the expression on Tyler Harrington's face when he recognized me across the conference table. I think I would tell him something simpler and harder and more important. I would tell him, be careful what you use as your reason for getting up, because the thing that drives you changes you in the shape of itself. Spend 20 years being driven by an unhealed wound, and you will arrive at your destination and find that the wound is still there, and that you have built your entire life around it, and that the architecture of that life, as impressive as it may be from the outside, has a specific quality of coldness at its center that no professional achievement and no documented financial truth will warm. I don't regret what I did. I want to be clear about that. I am a professional who did his job with complete integrity, and in doing so, also served a truth that deserved to be served. I don't feel bad about where Tyler and Madison Harrington are today. I don't feel bad about the mansion changing hands. These are the legitimate consequences of documented facts. But I miss the version of me that might have existed if none of it had happened. The one who didn't learn to keep everything at arm's length. The one who didn't build distance as infrastructure. I miss something I never got to have, which is maybe the most specific kind of loss there is. Not the loss of something you held, but the loss of something you can only see in the shape of its absence. Paige Turner called me once, about a year after the case closed. We had not spoken in almost 3 years. She called on a Saturday morning, and I answered, and we talked for about 20 minutes. Not about anything important. Her new position, a city I had mentioned wanting to visit, a book we had both read around the same time years before. At the end of the call, she said, "You sound different." I asked her how. She said, less like someone carrying something they haven't named yet. I thought about that for a long time. I'm still thinking about it. I don't know what comes next. That's not false modesty. I have the career, the stability, the professional reputation that was built from everything that happened. I have the Sunday calls with my mother. I have a clarity about what I'm capable of that I earned through work I'm genuinely proud of. And I have the specific permanent alteration that 23 years of a particular kind of driving will produce in a person, a quality that Paige recognized, that Sarah Bennett had always navigated around, that I have lived with for so long it's hard to know which parts of it are damage and which parts are just me. Some mornings I get up and the apartment is quiet and the light is good, and I make coffee and sit at the window, and the thing at the center is not cold. Some mornings it's something closer to okay, not healed. Okay, I take that. Let me leave you with one thing. When I walked out of that building on the October afternoon of the final meeting, I passed the lobby fountain, a small decorative one near the entrance that someone had installed at some point during the building's better years. I don't know why I stopped at it. I had walked past it many times across those weeks. But I stopped that afternoon, with my briefcase in my good suit, and I looked at the water moving in the basin, and I thought about the Harrington fountain, the circular driveway, the back gate, the borrowed toolbox. I thought, you made it here. Through everything they put in the way, through the years and the work and the cost, you made it here. And then I thought, but is here where you actually wanted to go? I'm still working on the answer. If this story hit you in any particular place, I want to know about it. Put in the comments what you would have done in my position, when you were 16, at that kitchen table, when they told you that you were leaving without payment and without your name. When you had nothing but the truth, and the truth wasn't enough. Because I've never stopped thinking about whether I made the right choices at each of those points. And I'd genuinely like to know how it looks from the outside. Because from the inside, even now, it is not entirely clear.